"Get out, this isn't your home." The words cut through the air, heavier than any slammed door. How does a father become a trespasser in the place his own hands helped pay for? It felt like I had stumbled into the middle of a family drama, only the script was written in silence and betrayal. Before we move forward, please subscribe to the channel and share in the comments what time it is where you are right now. The condo smelled of new paint and varnished floors, that strange mixture of beginnings and endings. The leather sofa sat in the corner, tagged at $10,500, its shine reflecting the light from a brand-new 70-inch television. I pressed my palm against the cool steel of the front door key, the metal biting into my skin, as if reminding me of the 20 years I had spent gripping a truck's steering wheel across endless highways. 20 years and $120,000 in savings now poured into this place for my daughter, Emma. I remember the day she opened the envelope with the bank receipt inside. Her eyes widened, her breath caught, and she hugged me like the little girl who once believed her father could fix everything with duct tape and determination. "This is my gift to secure your future," I said, my throat scratchy from diesel miles and sleepless nights. "Thank you, Dad," she whispered. "You'll always have a place here." Those words glowed then like sunlight through clean glass. I believed them. I wanted to believe them. To me, this condo wasn't just drywall and mortgage payments. It was a covenant, a safe harbor built on sacrifice and trust. But even sunlight casts shadows, and I can't help but wonder now, can a promise spoken in joy endure the weight of ambition that hides in silence? I carried in my old recliner, the one with the frayed armrest and the faint smell of tobacco from years gone by. I set it in the corner of the living room, next to a small shelf where I placed my worn paperbacks, Steinbeck, Hemingway, a Bible with a cracked leather spine. Across from it, the leather sofa gleamed like a showroom piece, price tagged at $10,500, while the 70-inch television stared down at us from the wall like a silent judge. I lowered myself into the recliner and felt something close to pride. This corner was mine, carved out not from bricks or titles, but from memory. It was the one piece of myself I allowed into Emma's new world. "It feels like I belong here too," I said softly, half hoping for reassurance. Her reply came distracted, her eyes still on her phone. "Of course, Dad. Of course." The words should have warmed me, but they hung in the air like smoke that refused to clear. Was it comfort, or was it dismissal? I couldn't tell. In that moment, I realized how fragile belonging could be, how quickly a home might shift from welcome to exile. I studied the space again, the polished floors, the echo of our footsteps, the scent of new paint still clinging to the walls. It looked perfect. But sometimes perfection itself is a mask. A house can gleam while its foundation begins to crack. And I couldn't help but sense a quiet deceit, hidden like a splinter beneath polished wood, waiting for the day it would surface. This was supposed to be our home. Yet a question pressed at me as I sat in that corner, recliner creaking beneath my weight. Was it really ours? Or was it only hers? It was only a few weeks after I'd placed my recliner in the corner that the rhythm of the condo shifted. Emma walked in one Friday evening, her hand looped around the arm of a man I had never met. His name was Brian. 30 years old, tall, carrying the confidence of someone who already believed he belonged. He wheeled in 2 large suitcases as though the decision had been made long before the door opened. I stood in the doorway of the living room, watching him drop his bags on the polished floor. The sound echoed against the walls, sharp, invasive, as if the house itself winced. "Is he planning to stay long?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Emma's reply came fast, too fast. "Dad, don't make this difficult. He's part of my life now." She brushed past me to clear space near the sofa, stacking aside the throw pillows I had bought for her last Christmas. The scent of cologne, strong and unfamiliar, filled the room. His shoes, still dusty from the street, pressed marks into the rug I had carried from my old house. It wasn't just his presence that unsettled me. It was the quiet assumption beneath it, the way he spread out like someone unrolling a map over unclaimed land. I lowered myself into the recliner, feeling its springs creak beneath me, a reminder of years that had already weighed down my body. My corner suddenly seemed smaller, fragile, as if it could be erased with a single careless laugh. He glanced at me and smiled politely, but the smile didn't reach his eyes. "Nice place," he said, his tone smooth. "You must feel proud." Proud. The word tasted bitter now. I had imagined this condo as a shared promise, a bridge between generations. But with Brian standing there, suitcase open, clothes spilling out as though he owned the closet already, the promise felt rewritten. A new chapter, uninvited. I couldn't shake the question as the evening grew heavier. A guest can knock on the door and be welcomed. But how long before a guest decides the key belongs to him? And in the silent pages of this unfolding family drama, how long before I am the one left outside, watching through glass? Dinner had always been a ritual for me, a place where families reset themselves after the noise of the day. But that night, the table felt less like a gathering and more like a stage. The clatter of cutlery on porcelain sounded sharper, the silence between bites heavier. Emma had made pasta, her favorite recipe from college, but no amount of garlic or olive oil could mask the bitter taste sitting in my chest. Brian leaned back in his chair, a glass of red wine in his hand, eyes fixed on me with a smile that didn't quite reach sincerity. "You know, Robert," he said casually, "sometimes you talk like a man who never left the driver's seat. Maybe it's time you updated that old trucker mindset." Emma shifted uncomfortably, her laugh strained and brittle. "Brian," she began, but her voice trailed off. I placed my fork down, steady and deliberate. "Funny thing," I replied, meeting his stare. "That old mindset is what kept me alive through 20 winters on I-70, what saved enough money to put a roof over our heads, including yours apparently." The tension thickened like smoke no window could clear. Brian smirked, swirling the wine in his glass. "Maybe you should think about having your own place, Robert. This isn't a retirement home." I leaned forward, the light catching the lines carved by 6 decades of labor. "Amusing, really, especially considering I paid the down payment on this condo." The words landed like stones in water, rippling through the silence. Emma's eyes darted between us, her fork frozen midair. "Please, can we not do this tonight?" she whispered. But her plea only underscored what I already felt. The balance of this home was shifting, and I was no longer at the center. I sat back, hearing the hum of the refrigerator in the corner, steady and indifferent, as though it bore witness to a play I never auditioned for. Somewhere in the shadows of that evening, respect was slipping away, and with it the fragile bond that held us together. What becomes of love when respect dies first? In every revenge story, there's always a spark, the moment when something sacred is mocked, diminished, or cast aside. And I wondered, as I stared at my untouched plate, if this was the moment mine began. If this story touched something deep inside you, please like and subscribe. Your support keeps these stories alive. It happened without warning, like a door slammed in the middle of a quiet night. Emma stood near the kitchen counter, arms folded, her tone cold enough to frost the glass. "Dad, you should find somewhere else to live. This condo is mine, not yours." For a moment, I thought I had misheard. The refrigerator hummed behind her, the ceiling fan turned lazily above us, and there I was, clutching the handle of my Samsonite suitcase. I had only pulled it out to reorganize some old clothes, yet suddenly it felt like a prop in a play I hadn't auditioned for. I stared at her, trying to see my little girl beneath the woman giving me marching orders. "You're serious?" The words stumbled out, thin and fragile. She shifted her gaze, uneasy but firm. "Brian and I need space. You're interfering." Interfering. That was the word. After 2 decades of truck stops, toll booths, and motel coffee that tasted like burnt rubber, After saving $120,000 so she could sign papers with a smile, I had apparently graduated to interference. A part of me wanted to laugh. Not the kind of laugh that frees you, but the kind that tastes of iron, dark and bitter. It's almost funny, isn't it? A man spends half his life building walls strong enough to shield his family, only to be told he no longer belongs inside them. I set the suitcase down by the door, the wheels rattling against the hardwood. The sound seemed louder than it should have been, echoing through the apartment like an accusation. My hand lingered on the handle, knuckles white, as if gripping it tighter would somehow anchor me to this place. Emma crossed her arms tighter, as if bracing herself. "Dad, please, don't make this harder than it already is." I wanted to ask her if she remembered the day she promised me I'd always have a place here. I wanted to remind her of the papers with my name on the transfer, the receipt ink still sharp after all these years. But the words stayed locked in my throat. Maybe I was afraid of hearing the answer, afraid of confirming that my worth had been reduced to a dollar figure already forgotten. How does a man get thrown out of the very walls he helped build? And worse, what happens to the father who suddenly has no place left to call home? The door closed behind me with a soft click, but it felt like a slam that shook my ribs. I sat on the hallway floor, back against the cold plaster wall, Samsonite suitcase parked by my side like a silent, stubborn dog that refused to leave. The air smelled faintly of bleach, and someone else's dinner drifting from an apartment down the corridor. The fluorescent light above flickered every few seconds, buzzing like an insect too tired to die. My neighbors passed by in slow steps, their voices lowered but sharp enough to pierce. "Isn't he the one who paid for that condo?" one whispered, glancing over her shoulder. I let out a dry laugh, the kind that burns more than it relieves. "That's right," I muttered under my breath. "But I'm the stranger now." The words came out cracked, like glass, splintering in the cold. The suitcase handle dug into my palm as I adjusted it, heavier somehow than the last time I carried it. Maybe because this time, it wasn't just shirts and books inside. It was 20 years of asphalt miles, truck stop breakfasts, missed birthdays, and every sacrifice I had stacked on top of another until I could finally write her a check for $120,000. And now it sat in the hall with me, reduced to luggage. I tried to picture myself from the outside. A man in his 60s, hunched on a carpet runner that smelled faintly of mildew, clutching a suitcase like it contained the last shred of dignity he owned. A tragic punchline in some black comedy of family. I almost chuckled at the absurdity. Almost. But the sound caught in my throat, swallowed by the weight of it all. Which is heavier, I wondered, as I stared at the dull shine of the suitcase wheels, the burden of leather and clothes, or the weight of betrayal pressed against my chest. I hadn't planned to speak to anyone. The hallway had already taken enough of my dignity, but sometimes humiliation has a way of finding an audience. Mrs. Carson, who lived 2 doors down, paused on her way back from the mailbox. She looked at me with that mix of pity and curiosity reserved for people caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her voice dropped, though it carried well enough for me to hear. "I overheard your daughter talking with her friends the other night. She said you only loaned her the money, that you never really contributed to owning this place." The words landed harder than the suitcase against my knee. Loaned. As if 2 decades of driving 18-wheelers across rain-slick highways, as if every missed holiday, every motel night, every saved dollar were reduced to a casual transaction. A loan, like something scribbled on a napkin and forgotten. I let out a breath, my lips curling into a smile too sharp to be joy. "A single lie," I murmured, "can erase decades of sacrifice." The hallway swallowed the words, but the bitterness clung to me like the scent of spilled gasoline, impossible to wash away. I thought of Emma's promise, her whispered assurance that I would always have a place here. And now, to imagine her recasting my gift as nothing more than a ledger entry. What story was she telling about me behind closed doors? Had Brian fed her these lines, planting seeds of deceit until they bloomed in her own voice? Or had she chosen them herself, rewriting history in the presence of friends who didn't know better? The walls of the condo stood just feet away, solid and bright with new paint, but they may as well have been a fortress. My name, my blood, my labor, it was all invisible from the other side. If truth can be buried so easily beneath polite lies and clever retellings, who will dig it up again? And when it surfaces, will anyone believe it? The whispers in the hallway clung to me like damp clothes. I knew I couldn't fight shadows with words alone. Lies spread fast, but numbers, they leave a trail. That night, I sat at the small desk in my rented room, the glow of my laptop washing my face in pale blue. My fingers moved slowly, almost trembling, as I logged into my old email account. Buried in the inbox were threads of conversations, confirmations, transfers, pages and pages of digital dust. Then, there it was, the receipt. A wire transfer for $120,000 dated 3 years ago from my account directly into hers. The numbers lined up as clean as railroad tracks, unbending and undeniable. I printed it out, the paper still warm when I held it. Funny how ink on a page can feel heavier than the steel of an entire truck cab. I thought about Emma's friends hearing her claim it was just a loan, a casual gesture, and here I had proof carved in digits, cold and loyal. I whispered to myself, not sure if I wanted the walls or the night to hear me. People can steal words, twist them until they don't resemble truth anymore, but they can't steal numbers. Numbers don't flinch, don't lie, don't get embarrassed when confronted. The printer spat out more sheets, bank statements, confirmations, timelines. Every page was another stone for the foundation I had already built. I stacked them neatly, the weight pressing against my palm like an anchor in a storm. And still, a question gnawed at me. Was paper more faithful than blood? Could a receipt outlast a promise? Could a bank ledger hold tighter to me than my own daughter ever would? If this story stayed with you for a moment, support us by liking and subscribing. Every click helps us tell the next one. Emma's 30th birthday should have been a celebration. A room filled with laughter and candles flickering against champagne glasses. Instead, the air carried a weight that no one could quite name. The restaurant in downtown Houston was dressed in soft lights and white linen tablecloths. Balloons hovered near the ceiling, and a cake sat waiting with 30 candles ready to burn. Yet I arrived with something heavier than any gift bag. I had folded the printed receipts into a neat envelope, the edges sharp as a blade. My fingers brushed over them during dinner, each page whispering that numbers do not bend the way words do. Guests toasted to Emma, their glasses raised high, their voices warm. But beneath their cheer, I heard an echo, the memory of neighbors repeating her claim that I had only loaned her the money. When the laughter swelled, I rose slowly from my chair. The sound of it dimmed around me. I placed the envelope on the table, sliding it across the linen until it stopped in front of Emma's plate. My voice was steady, but it carried the weight of years spent biting back silence. You've told people I never helped you, that what I gave was nothing. I looked at her directly, the envelope between us like a wall of ink and numbers. Then tell me, Emma, what do you call this? The room fell still. Forks froze in midair. Even the background music from the restaurant seemed to shrink into the corners. Emma's hand hesitated before touching the envelope, as if it burned to the touch. She opened it, her eyes moving across the black and white lines, the transfer of $120,000 in my name. Her face paled, the smile she wore moments before sliding off like paint in the rain. No one spoke. Not Brian, not her friends, not the family gathered around. All of them stared, waiting for her to answer, waiting for me to break. She closed the envelope with trembling fingers, but the silence had already done its work. Promises, like glass, do not shatter with noise, but with quiet. when everyone sees the crack that can't be hidden anymore. And I stood there, wondering what fractured first in that moment, the mask she wore for her friends, or the bond between father and daughter. The birthday confrontation still hung in the air like smoke after a fire. For days, Emma avoided me, her voice short, her eyes darting away when I tried to reach her. But the silence was not hers alone. There was a new rhythm in the condo, one that came from Brian's shadow, and I began to see what had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface. I caught their voices one evening, drifting from the kitchen when they thought I was asleep. Brian's tone was low, sharp enough to cut. "If he stays here, we'll never sell this place. He has to go. Do you hear me?" Emma's reply cracked like thin glass. "I didn't think it would come to this. He's still my father." Brian didn't flinch. "Your father is an obstacle. If we want a future, if we want freedom, he's in the way." His words dripped with the kind of confidence that only comes when you've convinced yourself the lie is nobler than the truth. I stood frozen in the hallway, heart pounding not from surprise, but from recognition. It made sense now. The whispers from neighbors. The way Emma had rebranded my sacrifice as a loan. The sudden coldness in her tone. It was never entirely hers. Brian had planted the lines, rehearsed the script, and she, my daughter, had become the performer. The irony almost made me laugh, though the sound would have been bitter. Every family drama has its villain, but the cruelest twist is when the villain isn't loud or monstrous, but calm, persuasive, whispering in the ear of someone you love most. Later, when Emma walked past me, she couldn't meet my eyes. I wanted to reach out, to ask if she even believed her own words anymore. But the silence stretched between us like a rope, fraying strand by strand. And I wondered, with a heaviness that settled deeper than any burden I had carried down the highways, is betrayal worse when it comes from love? Or when it comes from greed wearing love's mask? I found myself in a modest office downtown, the kind with coffee rings on the desk and a wall clock that ticked too loudly. Carla Jenkins sat across from me, her glasses perched low, her pen tapping against a yellow legal pad. She was maybe in her 50s, the sort of woman who looked like she'd stared down worse than broken families and forged promises. I slid the stack of documents toward her. Bank transfers, receipts, emails, proof that my $120,000 wasn't some vague memory, but a line of ink carved into history. She skimmed quickly, her eyes narrowing, her lips pressing into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Robert," she said finally, her voice calm but edged with steel. "You didn't gift this. You invested. That makes you a co-owner by law. They can twist words, but they can't twist this." She tapped her finger against the receipt, the sound sharp as a gavel. I leaned back in the chair, letting out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. For weeks, I'd been treated like a squatter in the home I helped secure, as though I were nothing more than a guest who overstayed his welcome. To hear her say it so plainly, it was like someone finally reminding me I wasn't crazy. "Still," I chuckled darkly, the sound catching her attention. "Funny, isn't it? You can drive 18-wheelers through ice storms, dodge drunk drivers on I-10, keep your rig upright when the wind tries to flip it, and no one questions your skill. But stand in your daughter's condo and suddenly you need a lawyer to prove you exist." Carla didn't laugh. She set her pen down and looked me in the eye. "This isn't about proving you exist. It's about protecting what you built. You've been carrying guilt like it's cargo, but this is your right. If they try to erase you, we'll fight." I stared at the papers again, at the stark numbers and dates lined up in neat rows. They didn't lie. They didn't flinch. "Then it's time," I said slowly, almost to myself. "Time to protect what I've built." The office fell quiet, the hum of the air conditioner the only witness. And I wondered, not for the first time, does justice only speak when a lawyer gives it a voice? The courtroom smelled faintly of paper and polished wood, the kind of scent that carries both history and judgment. The ceiling fans whirred overhead, indifferent to the weight of words being spoken below. I sat stiff in my chair, the envelope of documents in my lap, while Emma sat across the aisle, her eyes fixed on some invisible point above the judge's head. Her lawyer spoke first, the same line I had heard whispered through neighbors' mouths and repeated at her birthday table. It was a loan, a father helping his daughter temporarily, nothing more. Emma nodded, her lips pressed thin, as if willing herself to believe her own story. The judge adjusted his glasses, looking down at the paperwork I had submitted. His finger traced the numbers, the dates, the clear line of the $120,000 transfer. The silence stretched, broken only by the scratch of his pen against the page. Then his voice rang steady across the room. The evidence shows Mr. Robert is a co-owner of the property. The words landed heavier than any gavel. I felt my chest tighten, not with triumph, but with a sorrowful clarity. I rose slowly, meeting the eyes of the court, but my words were meant only for my daughter. I never wanted to own brick and mortar. I only ever wanted to own trust. A murmur rippled through the room, some leaning back, others glancing at Emma, whose face drained pale under the fluorescent lights. She had no script left to recite, no shield against the sharpness of the truth laid bare in numbers. I sat again, my palms pressed against my knees, feeling the ache of 61 years in my bones. The victory was hollow, like a medal handed out at a funeral. Justice had spoken, yes, but at what cost? And I asked myself, as the papers were gathered and the gavel finally struck, what matters more in the end, the judgment of law or the judgment of family? If this journey stirred your heart, leave a like and subscribe. It's the fuel that lets us keep creating more. The courtroom emptied slowly, footsteps echoing like aftershocks of the gavel's strike. Emma stayed behind, shoulders hunched, her mascara smudged in uneven streaks. She clutched the judge's ruling in her trembling hands. The paper seemed to weigh more than the verdict itself. She was ordered to either compensate me fairly or recognize me as co-owner. There was no escaping the ink on those pages. No clever words, no whispered lies to friends. No reshaped story could undo it now. Brian stood beside her for a moment, jaw tight, eyes darting across the room like a man searching for a door that wasn't there. Then, with a bitter scoff, he muttered something too low for me to catch and stormed out, his polished shoes slamming against the tile. The door swung shut behind him, the sound abrupt, final. Emma's breath hitched. "I didn't want it to end like this," she whispered through tears. Her voice cracked, thin and raw, as if she were finally speaking without his script. I held her gaze, though my own chest felt heavy enough to cave. "No," I said quietly. "You didn't want it to end. But the day you chose to erase me, that was the day you wrote this ending yourself." The silence that followed was louder than any argument. She buried her face in her hands, and I watched her shoulders shake. Yet the question pressed at me like an old wound. Were those tears for me, or for the ruin of the story she had built with Brian? The papers crinkled in her grasp, cold, indifferent, unbending. And I couldn't help but wonder, can tears ever wash away betrayal, or do they only leave the salt behind? The court's decision gave me rights, but rights don't keep a man warm at night. So I took what was mine and walked away, settling on a small house at the edge of Houston's sprawl. $95,000. Peeling white paint. A roof that creaked in the wind. Still, when I signed the papers, I felt something I hadn't in months. Air filling my lungs without shame clinging to it. I moved in with little more than a suitcase and the old recliner I had dragged from Emma's condo. I set it by the front window, its fabric worn smooth from years of holding me after long drives. It looked almost comical against the bare room, but in its sagging arms I saw a kind of truth no marble countertop or leather sofa could offer. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the trees, I sat in that chair, listening to the quiet. No sharp voices, no footsteps of a man who wanted me erased. Just silence, thick and strange. But mine. I muttered to the empty room, half in defiance, half in wonder. This house may be small, but it breathes honesty. I can live with that. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling fan wobbling above me, and thought about what we measure as wealth. For some, it's square footage, stainless steel appliances, numbers in an account. For me now, it was the simple peace of not being treated as an intruder within my own sacrifice. And I asked myself, as the night deepened, can peace ever outweigh the grandeur of any mansion? It had been months since the ruling, months since I'd moved into my modest house and found a rhythm in its quiet. The days passed with the sound of birds scratching at the fence, the creak of the old recliner, the smell of coffee cooling too fast in a chipped mug. Peace had settled, not perfectly, but enough. Which is why the knock on my door one gray afternoon felt like an intrusion. When I opened it, Emma stood there. Her face was pale, her eyes swollen as if she had been wrestling with herself for nights. She looked smaller than I remembered, as though the weight of truth had finally pressed her down. "Dad," she said, her voice breaking at the edges. "I need to tell you something. About Brian." I let her in, though every step she took across my bare floor sounded louder than I liked. She sat at the table, fidgeting with her hands, the silence stretching until she finally blurted it out. He made me believe you were holding me back. He told me you were suffocating my future, that the only way to move forward was to cut you out. And I believed him. I studied her, this daughter who once promised I'd always have a place in her home. And you trusted him more than your own father." Her shoulders collapsed, tears spilling freely now. "He was drowning in debt, credit cards, loans, everything. Selling the condo was his plan all along. I didn't see it then. I thought he was protecting me, but he was just protecting himself." The confession filled the room, heavy as smoke. Part of me wanted to shout, to ask her how she could have been so blind, so easily swayed by a man whose loyalty was tied to his bank balance. But another part of me, older, quieter, just felt tired. I looked at her, this grown woman who still carried the face of the little girl I once carried on my shoulders. She had betrayed me, yes, but she had also been deceived. And what does a father do when his child is both the betrayer and the betrayed? She reached for my hand, tentative, shaking. "I'm sorry, Dad. I don't know if I deserve forgiveness, but I had to tell you." I pulled my hand back, not harshly, but enough to remind her forgiveness isn't granted on demand. My voice was low, worn. "The real question, Emma, is whether forgiveness can rebuild what greed has torn apart." The garden was quiet, except for the soft trickle of water from the hose. Robert moved slowly, letting the spray darken the soil around the roses he had planted in spring. The air smelled of damp earth and faint blossoms. It was ordinary, almost painfully so, yet inside him, the stillness held more weight than all the courtroom battles, more than the slammed doors and whispered betrayals. In that silence, his thoughts spilled like a voiceover from a story half-lived, half-remembered. Sometimes leaving is the only way to keep love intact. Sometimes justice isn't about money, it's about dignity. The house behind him was smaller, walls thinner, furniture modest. Yet it breathed honesty, something the larger home in Houston had long since lost. He thought of Emma's laughter as a child, of her promise that he would always have a place. Then he thought of the moment those words cracked under the weight of ambition, and how the fracture had revealed the raw truth of this family drama. And yet, here he stood, not a victor in some cold ledger of wins and losses, but a man who had walked through deceit and come out still holding on to himself. The story was never about triumph in the eyes of strangers. It was about survival of the soul, about remembering that walls can be rebuilt, but trust, once shattered, must be planted like seeds and tended if it has any chance to grow again. A robin landed on the fence, its chest bright against the gray sky, as if reminding him that even broken branches can hold new life. The phone on the patio table buzzed once. A text message from Emma. "Dad, can we talk again this weekend?" He didn't answer right away. He simply let the words linger, like an unopened letter waiting for the right hour. He smiled faintly, almost bitterly, yet with a flicker of hope. The recliner inside waited for him, old and frayed, but his alone. Maybe peace is smaller than we expect. Maybe it's not a mansion filled with laughter, but a small house that dares to breathe truth. And he wondered, almost aloud, what would you do if your own child told you, "You don't belong here"?